Thank you for coming. Good evening. I'm Barbara Lee. I'm a member of the board of the Princeton Adult School, and we have a special treat for you tonight. Our speaker is a nationally recognized expert on media policy, and particularly new media policy. And she's a professor at Rutgers Camden, lives in Philadelphia, and traveled here to be with us tonight on one of the busiest days of the year. So she's really being very generous with her time, and we appreciate that. Professor Ellen Goodman, as I said, specializes in information policy law, and she teaches in the law school at Rutgers Camden. Her research interests include media policy, spectrum policy, the use of information as a policy tool, advertising law, and the informational aspects of sustainability policy. She also, and I doubt that she'll be talking about this tonight, but you never know, is an animal law expert. So if we have a series on animals, maybe we'll get her to come back and talk about animals, because animals have rights, and I bet you she knows all of them. Professor Goodman is currently serving as a distinguished visiting scholar at the Federal Communication Commission's Future of Media project. She also has a grant from the Ford Foundation working on a project developing new policy principles for public media in a networked age. I told you she was the perfect person to talk to us tonight. She has served as an expert before the National Academies of Science and Technology, the Brookings Institution, and the Aspen Institute. She serves as co-director of the Rutgers Institute for Information Law and Policy, and she's a research fellow at American University's Center for Social Media. Before Ellen became one of my colleagues at Rutgers in 2003, she was a partner in the Washington, D.C. law firm of Covington and Burling, and that's one of the top law firms in Washington, D.C., and she was of counsel with them until 2009. She's also visited at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School of Communications, Wharton School of Business and Law School, and has been involved with Penn's Initiative for Global Environmental Leadership on green marketing issues. It sounds to me as though she has an awful lot of things she could talk to us about tonight, but what we have asked her to focus on is media policy and new media, and I give to you Professor Ellen Goodman.
Good evening. On this eve of Thanksgiving, I wanted to give thanks to Barbara and to Ingrid Reed for inviting me here. I'm not local, and I wasn't able to attend the previous lectures in this series, but I know the speakers by reputation, and I really am honored to follow them. My understanding is that you have discussed the rapidly changing state of journalism, as well as the technological revolution in mobile technology. And I suspect that perhaps someone has even presented you with the chestnut from Thomas Jefferson from a letter that he wrote to Edward Carrington in 1787, that were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. Keep in mind that Thomas Jefferson also said in a letter in 1806, as for what is not true, you will always find abundance in the newspapers. And in the same 1787 letter, that was the first one, he expanded that newspapers were only so vital so long as, quote, every man should receive those papers and be capable of reading them. So in these words of Jefferson's, I think we have all the themes of my talk: the centrality of information to a free nation, the imperfections of the commercial and partisan press, and the importance of universal access and media literacy. I've been asked to discuss my work on this Ford project, as well as my work with the FCC, and so you know what's coming now. The disclaimer, I should say that I'm speaking only for myself and not for the FCC or the government. In calling my talk from broadcast to broadband, you may wonder what I mean. Basically two things. First is a shift from a public broadcast architecture where the means of communication are controlled by the media entities themselves in the form of broadcast towers and broadcast facilities. And two, a shift in communications architecture more generally to one that we know from the internet, which is decentralized, where there are low barriers to entry, and the roles for public media are more varied and harder to define. Now, I have to confess that I'm used to talking to sort of inside baseball, to kind of communications-oriented audiences. And so I don't know if this is the norm here, but I would ask you to interrupt me with questions if I'm not being clear or if my talk is too jargony. So please raise your hand if it's not clear. Okay. Yeah, let's change the lighting. So a month ago, I would have begun this talk in a very different way. I would have talked about the possibility for new functions for the familiar public broadcast institutions, new needs, and new forms of support. And I will talk about all those things in a bit. But I feel the need to begin by recognizing the current environment in which discussions of public media are situated. The term public broadcasting refers to the 1,000 or so non-commercial educational television and radio stations that receive support through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting at the direction of a 43-year-old law called the Public Broadcasting Act, and at the will and whim of Congress through biennial appropriations. The current amount is about $420 million a year. This constitutes about 15% of the annual funding for public broadcasting. So in many cases, that is a 15% that could be replaced potentially by other sources of funding. Where it's most important is for stations in rural areas and less affluent areas where that 15% is more like 40% of the total budget. So those are just some numbers to keep in mind. There will almost certainly be a proposal in the next Congress to zero out this appropriation. So that is the environment there is for public broadcasting, and a big, perhaps the biggest fight in their history that they will be facing come January. Indeed, the President's Bipartisan Commission on Deficit Reduction, chaired by Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles, has proposed a few weeks ago in its draft report to cut funding to CPB as part of widespread and deep budget cuts. For those of you who live in New Jersey, you may know that the state government has already decided to end its approximately $4 million, I think that's right, $4 million in annual funding to the New Jersey Network, which produces daily news and the only sustained electronic media coverage of New Jersey public affairs. NJN has been unable to find a sustainable funding model to replace this state support and has pink-slipped most of its 150 employees. So it's almost certain that it will cease broadcasting in anything like its current form next year. By the end of this year, the state will have to make a decision about what to do with the 4 television and a dozen or so radio licenses that it holds throughout the state. So, in response to these threats, you can expect to hear the usual defenses against cutting public broadcasting. Almost certainly, you will be seeing Big Bird. And at the most basic level, of course, this is an appeal to public television as a safe space for children, as a trusted name in children's programming, and more broadly as a home for high-quality programming that the commercial market does not produce, at least not for mass consumption. I think there's a deeper story here in Big Bird. If all government funding were to cease, the fact is that Sesame Workshop, which produces Sesame Street, would continue. The suggestion that we'd lose Sesame Street and Big Bird if we lost public broadcasting is probably not accurate. The actual point is more subtle. What we might lose is the next Sesame Street, the one that we don't know about, The workshop has been an innovator in every sense of the word. It has found a sustainable business model which allows for it to do without public funds, so it actually does not receive public funding. Its programming is data-driven and tested for results in terms of academic and social performance of the children that view it and also use it online and in its other forms. And this model of data-driven programming and results testing has been adopted in the commercial marketplace. And so I think what used to be called the Children's Television Workshop is now called the Sesame Workshop. What it shows us is the way in which the platform for public broadcasting provided the support and sort of the R&D. You can think about it in the scientific model, the R&D for a kind of programming innovation, which then was introduced into the marketplace and became sustainable on its own, and in fact was a boon to the private marketplace because it was really started the commercial children's programming. So that is the more complicated story of Big Bird that's hard to get into a soundbite. And so what Sesame Workshop has done with this early support, started in 1967, is taken this programming, first of all, around the world and then into vertical content categories that go way beyond television programming. All sorts of material, curricula, social media, online media concerning, you see the categories here, health and wellness, et cetera. So again, the value of the public broadcasting network was not in the cash subsidy to the workshop, but rather was creating a space for this kind of nonprofit venture to flourish without continuing financial investment. Another thing that you'll hear from defenders of public broadcasting over the next year or so they will present charts like this, which I know you can't read, so I'll tell you what it is. This is a chart that shows the level of public trust in public broadcasting institutions, in this case PBS, which is the bottom lightest bar in each of these years. Public trust in PBS as compared with other institutions such as Congress, and they're all the same, Congress and the courts and commercial media. So it's held pretty constant and it's pretty marked. And that will be trotted out as a way to try to define what the value is in public broadcasting. And then finally, you will hear that the U.S. spends this $420 million amounts to about $1.30 per capita a year on public broadcasting, which is paltry compared to what our Western peers spend on public broadcasting. And they have a very different structure. They don't do annual appropriations from the government. Instead, they typically have a license fee on the ownership of a television, so that it's almost universal contributions to a fund based on ownership of a TV. So it generates a lot more funding, and of course, these countries often have very different rationales for public broadcasting and very different uses of it. Now, on the other side, those in favor of axing public broadcasting will point to the recent controversy over NPR's firing of political analyst Juan Williams, who also had a gig at Fox News and broke NPR's editorial rules when he expressed personal opinions on air, which also happened to be prejudiced. Critics have seized on this decision to fire him to repeat the common refrain that public broadcasting, radio in particular, is politically correct to a fault, is liberal and elitist, that it serves special interest, and that it is unneeded in a media environment that provides a huge amount of choice. And here, too, the situation is complicated. These critics have a point. Public radio's 30 million listeners do not reflect the demographics of the nation. They over-index among white, more educated, more liberal, and wealthier Americans. PBS's demographics are a little different. Public TV viewers are not necessarily more liberal and white, but they are older than average. Public television basically has almost no appeal to anyone between the age of 10 and 45. That entire demographic is not, seriously, does not watch public television. So public broadcasting leaders get this, and they feel a great imperative to diversify their audiences, not just because it's in the public interest, but because it's the future of their membership in a nation that's becoming younger and more diverse. So in a sense, they're conceding that they have failed to serve the entire nation. So there's consensus among both supporters and detractors that they're underserved constituencies. I think there's disagreement over who the underserved really are, and whether they are ideological or demographic in nature. So all of this I present as preface to what I think the real question is, which is, what's the point of public service media in the digital age? And I think unless supporters of public media can begin to answer this question in a more coherent way than by trotting out Big Bird, they will not be able to make the case for continued support, at least over the long haul. So I think in getting at this question, we have to ask, what is the market doing well in this information age? Where are the information gaps? Does there remain a need for public investment in media? And if so, what should we expect in return for this investment? No matter how comparatively small that investment is as compared to our peer nations. And once we answer these questions, we can then ask, what's the form that that support ought to take? Okay, so I'm going to lay out for you what I think are the best answers to those questions. I want to begin with what I think are reasonable critiques of the current system of public broadcasting. The first, which I sort of just covered, is that it's out of touch. That it's not just demographically too limited, but that its programming related to that is stale. This is particularly true of television. And that it has failed in its efforts to reach new populations, to engage them, or it hasn't tried hard enough. So this is not just a matter of diversifying on-air talent. It's a matter of, and when I say this, I'm restating what I think are conclusions from the field. So these are not my opinions, but what I've gathered sort of inductively from hearing leaders in the field critique their own efforts. It's a matter of finding content that connects more directly to people's lives and that feels more relevant to them. Next critique is that, I'll just pull them all up, is that public broadcasting is irrelevant. So it arose at a time when there were 3 commercial networks, when broadcasters programmed to the least common denominator, when there was no space for niche programming or serving underserved audiences. Of course, that's no longer the world we live in. There are plenty of platforms on cable and the internet for niche programming. And so the challenge for public media is to define what value it adds. What does it do that commercial media doesn't do? What can it do that's risky, innovative, and different from what others are doing? And this is actually quite difficult because funding comes disproportionately from members that enjoy the classics and things like Antiques Roadshow. You can take something like Antiques Roadshow, and it is not an example of something that is innovative. It wasn't. It was in its time. Originally, it was innovative, but of course now that genre has been perpetuated all over the commercial media. And so at the same time, it's a big moneymaker in terms of membership appeal for public television. So what I'm suggesting is not easy to sort of jump from one ice float to another and engage in newer forms of programming and innovation. The last critique is that public broadcasting institutions are stuck by virtue of their own governance problems and their own inabilities to cooperate and to restructure themselves. And this gets way down in the weeds, but if we have time in Q&A, it really has to do with the whole structure of the system, the fact that there's no central strategic planning. The stations are often owned by universities and by other entities that have interests that are far wider than the particular media. They don't act like media companies. They act like the other kinds of institutions that they are. Okay. So now let's turn to the case for public media. From a classic social welfare perspective, we can expect the market to underproduce certain kinds of desirable information and narratives. This is particularly the case, for example, with investigative journalism. Investigative journalism costs a lot of money to do, and it is not widely valued as a consumer product. That means that people are not willing to pay as much for the product, if they're willing to pay anything, than the product produces in terms of social welfare. The same can be said for educational content. The same can be said for long-form documentary films. So some of the genres that public broadcasting has focused in do meet this criteria of being underproduced in the marketplace. There has been, some people thought that would disappear in the digital age. In other words, that because you could have niche content, you could disaggregate the audience and actually ensure that everything that people valued would be produced in the quantities that people wanted. But it hasn't turned out that way, and I'll get to in a minute what some of the findings are about investigative journalism. A slightly different argument for public media concerns public media's role as a non-commercial source of authority and credibility. So you're hearing this a lot in connection with the role that public radio is playing in an environment that is increasingly partisan and polarized. The figures on trust that I showed you suggest that the deliberate effort that public media makes to be objective and balanced, an effort that's not always successful, but was actually written into the Public Broadcasting Act as an aspiration for stations. They are required to be objective and balanced. Is of value to the public, particularly as commercial media abandons this role. We have many new forms of authority that are emerging in the digital age. Clay Shirky, who is a new media theorist, talks about algorithmic authority, which is the authority that Google has. We trust it because we believe that there's an objective algorithm underlying it that spits out information that we're looking for. There's something that I'm calling social authority, which is the authority of Facebook. We believe what's given to us because our friends have recommended, or like-minded people have recommended it to us. So public broadcasting is not a substitute for these forms of authority, but it's a complementary form of authority that is rooted in its deliberate attempt to provide information for no other reason than that it believes that it's in the public interest. And then finally, a third component of the case for public media is its role as a physical presence in communities. So this is much as Secretary of Education Arne Duncan thinks that schools have this role to play in addition to their role as educators. Many think that public media broadcast stations, as they are now, have a role to play as a communal hub and source of community services. So you're seeing this in Philadelphia, for example. WHYY hosts all sorts of community activities that are often linked to its broadcast, but not always. So it increasingly is looking for this form of connection in the community. In thinking about whether or not public broadcasting, and as I'm calling it, public media, because it is not just a broadcast-based medium anymore, in thinking about whether or not it can sort of rise to the aspirations that we're laying out for it, we have to consider the policy environment. And so just two things I will note here is policymakers have for the last couple of years been very focused on this journalism crisis, the fact that local papers are shutting down by the hundreds and journalists are being laid off by the thousands. And especially what that means in terms of loss of investigative reporting capacity. And then there's the national broadband policy, which I think I'm going to skip over, save for questions. So in terms of the journalism crisis, in the last year there have been half a dozen blue ribbon reports that have studied, and I'm sure you've heard about this in your previous lectures, what's happening to the investigative reporting capacity. So the first one was Pew Research Center report that concluded that here it's asking rhetorically, I don't know if you can read that, as the economic model that has subsidized professional journalism collapses, the number of people gathering news in traditional television, print, and radio organizations is shrinking markedly. What, if anything, is taking up that slack? And it concludes nothing. It concludes that blogs and digital media are not taking up the slack of investigative reporting. Then there was a report by Leonard Downey and Michael Schudson that also found the reductions in journalistic capacity to be worrisome. And the most influential was a Knight Commission report, also 2009. This was co-chaired by Ted Olson, the former Solicitor General under George W. Bush, and Marissa Mayer of Google. So from the right and from the left, from old media and from new media, they identified serious gaps in our information flow. And like other reports, turned almost desperately to public media to solve them. So all these reports end in what I sort of call this Hail Mary to public media. What are you going to do to solve this journalistic crisis? What they don't do is engage in the policy and structural change that would be necessary for public media to have a more robust journalistic presence. These issues, among many others, are being taken up by the FCC in this project that I'm working on, which is called the Future of Media Project. And I won't say too much about that except to say that it is it's very ambitious. It's unique in the history of the FCC, where the agency is trying to take a holistic look at all the policy that it is responsible for, but also policy, tax policy, procurement policy, other kinds of government policies that have an effect on the kind of media that we have, whether it's cable or satellite, commercial or non-commercial. And so these questions about the future of non-commercial media, public media, are central to this project, and a report will be coming out early next year that makes recommendations to Congress and to other parts of the government. Any remake of public media policy that pushes existing institutions in a direction that is more responsive to the journalism crisis, more useful for broadband policy, more aligned with the public interest, will have to start with this law from the Great Society. This is the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. And if you look at the original vision for the act and some of the language, I think you'll find that it's actually quite contemporary and quite adaptable to the digital age. So the next 3 slides give you a sense of what the Public Broadcasting Act was trying to do. This is the act that created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and ultimately created PBS and NPR. Created structures to knit all these local stations into one national network. First, there was this emphasis on access to quality communications in every town in the country. And to that end, the FCC reserved channels, you know, from the FM band. It's that lower end of the FM band that's the non-commercial reserve band. In TV, it wasn't done quite that way. It was just sort of channels here and there, so that every town would have a non-commercial broadcast outlet. And at the root of this access principle was a commitment to the equitable distribution of communicative capacity. In many communities, the public broadcasting station continues to be the only locally owned media outlet. Now, the alternative service that was going to be offered on these stations was not supposed to just be floated out on the airwaves, but public broadcasters were to reach out to the public and engage them with the service. You can look at this as an early recognition of the importance of links. Information and narratives that exist but do not connect don't have any purpose, don't serve. This kind of linkage and outreach that was imagined in 1967, of course, was limited by the broadcast technology and the 20th century model of production. In other words, that there was a single producer, that the program went out over the airwaves, one-to-many communication, which very much limited outreach, limited engagement with the public. It was a one-way with media actively pushing content out to the public but not taking anything back from the public. It was not social and, of course, not interactive in the way that digital communications are. And then I think the final goal of the Public Broadcasting Act was a particular kind of service, the production of a particular kind of service, information and narratives of use to audiences underserved by the market. So this is our kind of market mismatch point in the Act. Local content, minorities, children. And also the content, the service was supposed to be innovative and experimental, right? So not Antiques Roadshow, decade after decade. But a lab for innovative technologies, formats, business models. It was the Sesame Workshop. It was the kind of, supposed to spawn those kinds of innovations. So what I've done in my work is try to work from this text to a more contemporary vision for public media in the future, and try to identify what are the core missions, what are the core functions that public media is supposed to be undertaking. And what I've called them are create, curate, and connect. So the create part is what most of us think public media ought to be doing, right? Creating great, high-quality programming that the market won't give us, and we can focus on investigative journalism for now because that seems to be a screaming need. We can focus on kids programming. It may not be the case anymore that we need to focus on British dramas because those can be carried. Those do have a home now in other places where they didn't in the 70s and 80s. I still think it's the case that science programming, and again, these are not just my opinions, this is sort of what the data and the field suggests. Science programming, the commercial market has not picked up the slack in science programming. There was a time when it looked like the Discovery Channel might be doing that. It was a time when Bravo looked like it might be filling the niche for arts programming, but those commercial outlets have sort of changed direction. And so there are lots of genres we can think about that public media ought to be producing. But that's really only the beginning of what it should be doing. In addition, there is the curation of content. I think this is really a new function. This was not a function that they were playing in the pre-digital age. But now we live in a world where tremendous information clutter, tremendous productivity, production of information from all sorts of places, including from users, but also barriers to entry to produce film and digital applications are very low. And there's a role that, an important role that public media can play, and this is sort of in its trusted role as a credible authority, in curating that information, in identifying value in it, in cultivating it, in providing a megaphone and a platform for the best of it. And I can give you, I will save to the end some examples of these functions when I know how we're doing on time. And then finally, there is the connection. So this is what we saw with the term outreach and community resource, that notion in the Public Broadcasting Act. And as I said, the capability of doing that was very limited in the broadcast era. Now, of course, the capability for doing that is immense. The interest, we're seeing this focus on connection and engagement all over the media world. So it's what everyone, it's the holy grail. It's what commercial media wants. It's what advertisers want. The interest in traditional news served up from on high is dwindling. As Tom Rosenstiel of the Pew Center on Excellence in Journalism says, media must engage people's questions. And this happens through partnerships with users, with community groups, and institutions that have purchase on people's lives. So the project of connection is a project of connecting individuals and communities to information that's important for them to understand and to act on issues in their lives. And also to encourage participation in the production of information, so crowdsourcing information, pulling people into the creative function. These are my examples, but we're going to come back to them. Digital networks, and by that I mean new forms of distribution, new production capabilities, new kinds of demands, social networks, create new ways to structure these three basic functions. Each one can be performed by many decentralized actors that connect with each other through the network. So in other words, in the old world, you had a broadcast station that performed all these functions. They did the distribution, they produced some programming, they networked, these were local stations, networked with a national entity. PBS and NPR are membership organizations. Their members are the stations. So these stations did everything. They also curated content through PBS and NPR, creating a schedule, a national programming schedule. So although a somewhat decentralized structure with stations spread out all over the country, quite hierarchical and centralized decision-making, unified control of content, curation, and connection, all located in the station, and all using a single distribution technology, broadcasting. What digital technology and broadband architecture enables is a new kind of networking. So the little circles are, this happens to be for radio. And this is not a graphic representation. Well, it is a graphic representation, but these are actual producers, and the size of the circle shows sort of the uptake of their programming, the actual uptake of their programming. So the small circles are just producers, just people and small companies that are making public broadcasting programming. And they're not sending it to NPR for distribution through NPR's networks. They're actually sending it to each other. They are networking it online through an online marketplace. And in this way, there's able to be, the stations are able to have a much wider selection of programming. It can be, they're able to make many more connections in the community. They can network with community media, with schools, with libraries. There are new sources of content that they can choose from, and there are new sources of distribution. Some of this is going out over radio, some of it is going out in podcast form through digital networks. So moving from that example in radio, we can also think about the journalism space. So these nodes, those distributed nodes that you saw that are networked with each other, not going through the hub of a national hub, could also be new nonprofit journalism enterprises. And this gets to the question of what we mean by public media. So public media does not have to mean public broadcasting only. There are a lot of debates about what it should mean. In my view, it does entail being nonprofit, non-commercial, because I think that mission orientation is sort of core to what the function of public media is. In response to the journalism crisis and the abundance of laid-off journalists who are looking for work, there have arisen in the past few years, but mostly in the past year, a new crop of nonprofit journalism efforts. Some, like ProPublica, which is probably the most famous of these, are national in scope and focus on investigative stories. New Jersey Spotlight, which is less than a year old, does the same at the state level. California Watch does investigative stories in partnership with other organizations, including the University of California. So it has a model of working with the journalism schools to engage student labor, kind of on the model of the med school, where they're taking students and using them, milking them for everything they've got, and also training them. So what these entities share with public broadcasting is an intentional focus on providing trusted information to the public in place of other agendas, right? They don't have a commercial agenda. They don't have, they're not trying to advance a particular political point of view, and they are not social change organizations. What they don't share with public broadcasting is that they do not get funds from the government. But although I think that's the least of it, what they also do not share is a network of local outlets that are able to combine resources to support large-scale productions. So they are essentially unnetworked. And that may not be necessary. That kind of scale may not be necessary if you're doing a very local story. It is if you're doing larger stories with more geographic scope. And it also may be necessary for expensive database research and for the development of code and other technological tools to advance the journalistic mission. And that's exactly where public media has excelled, in creating the kind of scale for national production so that you can have series like Frontline and Nova, et cetera, where you couldn't if you were just scattered local stations. So where does that leave us? To me, it's quite obvious that the best world would be one in which you would have these entities working with the legacy public broadcasters so that these new entrants could take advantage of some of the structure and scale and network that public broadcasting has, in addition to the fact that radio, especially radio, continues to be a very powerful medium, more powerful than any digital distribution mechanism. And there are all sorts of examples of a story that gets 2 million listeners on NPR that is delighted to have 200,000 hits online. So it's just still a totally different scale of distribution. And so that's what the new entrants would get, that kind of scale and networking, also federal dollars. And what public media would get, the legacy institutions, is this kind of entrepreneurial spirit, the diversity that comes in through all these distributed nodes, and some of the other, the energy and the demographic spread. This chart here comes from a report called Public Media 2.0, which was put out by American University. And again, I don't know if you can see this, but these circles are, it is defining public media as including community institutions like libraries and hospitals, educational institutions, in addition to nonprofits and public broadcasting. I'm not sure I would go this far because I think there are reasons to exclude some of these from the public media, what we're considering a public media network, but it does show the outer limits. So, how likely are we to see a public media system that generates more value in terms of creation, curation, and connection? I think on the hopeful side, digital networks make everything that I'm talking about and the aspirations of 1967 possible in a way that they never were in 1967. There is much more opportunity for creation of fantastic programming at much lower cost. It doesn't need to be everything anymore. It can be very focused on areas where the market fails. And public media can abandon some of the genres and efforts that are now covered by what's called the long tail of digital distribution. Curation, I think there is a screaming need for curation, and there is, in our information-saturated world, and public media institutions have the technical ability now and the means to find and cultivate content in a way that they didn't before. Connection, as I said, this is the holy grail. Everybody wants this. I think public media is particularly well situated to engage its audience and its users, in part because they have a membership model. So membership model is all about engagement. They have a long tradition of having members, not just customers. You see commercial media now struggling with this notion of membership and trying to get members. So public media has a big head start that could be exploited to really forge deeper connections with users and with communities. That's the good news. The bad news is that the law that we have, I mean, putting aside all the politics that are going to intrigue us for the next year about defunding public broadcasting, even if it survives that, the structures that the 1967 Act put in place are really not that amenable to this vision. And the one just that I'll focus on is that the funding is broadcast bound by law. In other words, the law requires that about 65% of all the funding that goes through CPB go to broadcast stations. So that's the green chunk, the 49%, and that 15%. You don't need to worry about all these details. But that all goes to broadcast stations, and a lot of that is just for the broadcast infrastructure, running the transmitter, operating the tower, sending out these signals over the air. That's still pretty important in radio. In television, only about 10% of the public actually receives gets their TV over the air rather than through cable or satellite. So it's a huge investment in a dying technology. That's one problem. And the second problem is that if you're not a broadcast station, if you're one of these new entrants, these new journalistic entrants, these new radio producers, you have no claim on that funding. It's very difficult for you to get funding from CPB. So what we have is the sort of haves and have-nots from the federal funding standpoint. You've got NJN, as it was, an $18 million annual budget of $18 million with 150 employees. And then you have public TV stations, which are spending about 20 to 25% of their budgets, just as I said, on broadcast transmission and associated costs. And then you have the Young Turks coming in who have a completely different cost structure. Now, they don't have to operate broadcast facilities. They are operating on what looks, by comparison, as a shoestring, $1.6 million, $2 million, a dozen journalists. But if you look at their journalistic output, you're struck by how much you can do with that amount of money. Of course, as I said, they're missing the broadcast platform. So the point of this is that it would be nice if some of the people on the right could have access to some of the funds that the people on the left are getting. But the current act doesn't permit that. So what I think needs to happen is that we need to redefine the entities that are entitled to public media funding with an associated shift from infrastructure, especially broadcast infrastructure, to content and applications, because that's where we're missing, especially in the journalistic field, we're missing content. I think that the law needs to insist on new forms of networking so that if you are a public broadcast station in San Diego and there is a new entrant in the investigative journalism arena, it should at least be incentivized to cooperate with them, as well as other kinds of new nonprofit entities, so that there's a premium placed on cooperation and networking, so building that kind of distributed network, as opposed to keeping it all, which is where the incentives are right now, keeping it all inside the broadcast station. And then finally, we need to restructure the appropriation, the annual appropriation, which is so subject to political caprice, to a trust fund or other kind of sustained funding source. It will never be in the amount that our peer nations invest in public broadcasting, because that is just not the public broadcasting culture in this country. And I don't think it's that important that the numbers be that high. What is important is that the funding model change. And then finally, because I want to leave time for your questions, and if we have time, I can play some of these videos for you. I can't let you leave without talking a little bit about what is perhaps the biggest play in the future of public media, which is the broadcast spectrum, the television broadcast spectrum. So spectrum, for those of you who aren't wonky, is just the wireless, the airwaves that TV broadcasters use. And because of these numbers, because only 10% of the public actually gets their television service over the air, this is a tremendous natural resource that is being devoted to a technology that is not that valuable. Estimates are, we really don't know how much it's worth, but estimates are that it's worth $100 billion if it could be reallocated from TV broadcasting to wireless broadband. In other words, if we could use it with our iPads instead of with our TV sets, the government could get $100 billion from the new entrants that would bid for that, to use that spectrum. Now, 20% of that TV spectrum is in these reserved non-commercial channels. So in a way, they're sitting on what I like to think of as parkland, right? It was parkland reserved for this particular use. It is almost certain that there will be a reallocation. And in the next 5 years at the FCC, there will be a royal battle to see how this is done and where the money goes. And of course, as you can imagine, there will be relentless pressure to have that 100 billion or however much it is go to Treasury to reduce the deficit. There will be a band of public broadcasters and those who are interested in public media that will fight to have that, whatever the amount is that corresponds to the non-commercial spectrum, plowed back into public media. The argument being this was parkland reserved for a purpose. You don't sell parkland for an office building. You take, if you're going to get rid of the parkland, you take the value of that asset and put it back into the objectives that for which it was dedicated. And so that's a battle that's going to happen. And I think associated with that, when if we're talking about taking those resources and plowing them back into public media, we are actually going to have to answer all these tricky questions about what public media is supposed to be, who should be able to take advantage of that funds, how do we balance national interests with local interests, do the local communities from which these licenses came from, should they be the chief beneficiaries, or should we reallocate everything, based on, I don't know, the 2010 census? So those are all the questions that those of us in Washington policy circles are going to get to play with in the next 5 years. And I will stop there and take your questions.
Are we going to have a crisis or anything realistic is done to what the title crisis such as total elimination of all funding, elimination of the organizations that we currently see in public broadcasting? Is that going to have to happen before there's any meaningful progress on what we're talking about?
I think yes. I think we are going to have a crisis. And I think those of us who have been working on the NJN situation see sort of what a blessing a crisis can be in terms of, wasn't it Rahm Emanuel who said a crisis is too good a thing to waste or something? Didn't seem to work out all that well for him. But it's a with the dissolution of an organization or investment like that, there really is a lot of energy in this state about thinking how it should work. So one could imagine if funding were zeroed out for CPB, I think it would be a shame, but there probably would be a lot of, there might be some silver linings.
New Jersey's kind of unique because we're between New York and Philadelphia. It's kind of been a poor system.
Right.
I don't know if that particular status is going to enable New Jersey to be meaningful while New York and Philadelphia are struggling.
Well, it's that particular status that makes public media in New Jersey so important, perhaps more important than it is in other states that have a robust commercial media market that focuses on state concerns. And the woman. Well, so it's almost all the employees. I don't think it's all. I don't think it's not every one of them. But and my understanding is that almost all the employees are in TV. There's very little staffing of radio. There's not much NJN radio. You know, it's the state has the right to defund to withdraw funding, and if the institution doesn't have funding, it can't, you know, it can't function. So it may be that if it is functioning, it is then obligated. I don't know this under some agreement with the state under the terms of its operation, the Public Broadcasting Authority's terms of its operation, to do New Jersey news. But if it's not in operation, it can't function. There's no law that says the state has to fund this. You know, there's no sort of constitutional requirement that the state fund this, so the state can withdraw funds. And you know, if there had been a white knight to step up to say, I will fund it, maybe that white knight would have been obligated to do certain things about New Jersey programming. But there's no such white knight. Yeah. Right. So it is rare to have these. The point was Ingrid's reminding me to make clear that New Jersey is a special case, not only because it's sandwiched between major media markets, but also because it's rare for the public broadcasting licenses actually to be held by the state. In most cases, public broadcasting licenses are held by nonprofits, just community nonprofits. In some cases, they're held by universities. There were more cases where they were held by the state, but in over the last 20 years or so, states have tried to get out of the business of public broadcasting for obvious reasons. It creates, you know, a lot of conflicts, and states generally don't want to deal with these broadcast operations, so they've spun them off to nonprofits. New Jersey never did that, and now will have to do that. These licenses, in one form or another, unless they want to surrender them back to the FCC, are going to go to somebody. Yeah.
You part of the movement to say this. What is the position of the legislature on guest that? And what are you guys doing? What's the meaning of the future?
Well, I actually am not part of a movement to save NJN. I would say I'm more part of a movement to remake New Jersey public media into something new. And I don't, Ingrid, you should talk about this, she's more of an expert than I am, about the state of the legislative positions on this. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ingrid Reed, and until recently, I was at the Eagleton Institute of Politics, directing the New Jersey Project, and my work included understanding how New Jersey is covered by various media. And so I've been drawn into a coalition that's trying to answer the question that Ellen posed, and that is, what comes after a state-supported public media entity that is really only functioning on television broadcast, although I always get confused. The programs are available on cable, has no radio to speak of, and has been very behind the times, I would say, in using the internet to get news out to New Jerseyans. Both the legislature and the governor have said that in analyzing the situation, the constraints that are on a public media that depends on living by the rules of state government as a public authority, the hiring rules, the purchasing rules, so on, simply can't function in an entrepreneurial way, and there must be another way to do this, and they have zeroed out the appropriations for what we call NJN. And the governor's office and the legislature say they are open to transferring assets in some way. Of course, I think if the broadband was sold and it made lots of money, they wouldn't want it to go totally to the new entity. But right now, there's a lot of ambiguity about what will actually happen, because even the rules of transfer have not been established. There are two different bills in the legislature. So I think that from a practical point of view, New Jerseyans should want a robust public media, but face the fact that it is really old-fashioned the way it's working, and old-fashioned in not meeting people's needs the way other public media stations are behaving in other areas, which we should really use as models. Is that fair, Ellen, from
That's fair,
what
yeah.
you've heard? Okay.
For NJN? For New Jersey? Yeah, I mean, the numbers now are not robust, no. They're not good, and that has not been I don't know if it's for lack of trying or for lack of success, but.
Maybe I should just mention the STAR report. At the end of our last session, I'm going to give you a handout of what's happening with all kinds of entrepreneurial public media in New Jersey. But Paul Starr, who's on the faculty of Princeton University, together with some of his students, produced a report which is now commonly referred to as the STAR report. That was the first study that really gave widespread attention to the facts that I've tried to summarize for you about the state of public media in New Jersey. You can find that on the website of the New Jersey Public Policy Perspective. That's njpp.org. And it really describes a lot of the things that are hard to understand if you've never been associated with them, about the transmitters, the broadband in New Jersey, membership revenue in comparison to other places. It is, I think, really the best resource to understand where we have been, and then raises some questions about where we can go. So I think Princeton should feel very proud to have a resident who has made this contribution, and the university should also be proud that Paul Starr, as a faculty member, has been a public service to the state. And for those of you who remember Sandra Starr, the foundation that was started in her memory actually funded the very minimal research funds that were needed to create the report.
But I think your question is interesting and sort of goes to the purpose of public media. I bet you would find, I don't know if this is true, that if you looked at New Jersey residents, they'd be just as likely to be, more likely to be members of WNYC and WHYY, sorry? Yeah, and than NJN, and that's probably because, except for the New Jersey program, of which there's not a huge amount, it's PBS programming, and they're probably getting it from the other stations anyway. And so, and that is the role of that's what those New York and Philadelphia stations ought to be doing. They ought to be going for New Jersey dollars, and the commercial media, of course, doesn't care about the political subdivision of New Jersey, right? It cares about people and the eyeballs and the dollars that they're worth. And so it is a distinctive role of public media to care about the polity of New Jersey as a political subdivision. And it's that role, that is so important to fill, that NJN has done, with middling success. But if some entity or collaborative could fill that role, you could imagine, and really engage people and made them feel that it was worth something, you could imagine membership flowing.
What
Right, and this is the central paradox in public media, right? It's not supposed to be, the market's very good at giving people what they want. That's not the role of public media. They're not, and yet they're judged by what their ratings are. So in these hearings, Congress will ask about ratings, and it's not just chicken and egg, but it's between a wall and a hard place too. It is a puzzle, but I think that first of all, that's where engagement comes in and outreach, right? Here's your broccoli, we think it's good for you, and we want to reach out to you and get you to eat it, and we're going to make it more interesting and fun, and we're going to use voices that speak your language, and we're going to use people that you relate to, and we're going to change the tone. That's not going to work in all cases. The fact is, people don't want to consume investigative journalism, and not just 25-year-olds, but 55, unless you're a news junkie, it's really not that fun to read investigative stories. And the only reason why they were supported was because people were supporting the sports and supporting the restaurant reviews, and it all got bundled together, and so there were some resources thrown in investigative journalism. And now it's much more efficient. If you want sports, you can just pay for sports and send your eyeballs only to sports, and you don't need to support investigative journalism. And now, the fact is, I think we can all agree that investigative journalism provides a service even if nobody does watch it. It's one of those things that doesn't have to be consumed to provide value. It doesn't have to be broadcast. Is that what you mean? Right, and that's why public media, the definition should be expanded to include digital only. No, well, I would define all those as public media, as long, it's foundation-supported effort to do, like ProPublica, to do investigative journalism, has nothing to do. They are now in partnership with public media stations because they find it valuable to get that distribution, but they really don't have anything to do with public media. Public broadcasting, but I would call them public media. Well, no, you're absolutely right. NPR does not have that age gap. NPR has a different problem, which is that it's not reaching diverse audiences, which PBS is much more successfully. PBS, so it's actually quite fascinating that they have different sort of demographic problems. But I think that it's true that radio has been more successful with a younger demographic, and it can build on that. It needs to reach more different kinds of people of all ages. Yeah.
Can you comment on the cost for a radio station or a television station to stop broadcasting and instead use only the internet to reach its audience?
It's a great question, and it's one that is top of mind for all these broadcast executives. An easy answer would be, well, it's about $2 million a year for a TV station to actually engage in the physical broadcasting. It could save that, and then look at that. It would be that's the Chicago Tribune's budget right there. It could hire 12 journalists right off the bat. That's the easy answer, and it's probably the right answer for right now. But digital distribution is not free. And it's only been sort of low cost because that's what it's all riding on commercial infrastructure, right? That's what the Comcast and the Verizons have decided to make it. But as soon as first of all, as soon as if you're talking about audio, it's much cheaper. If you're talking about video, you start to hog a lot of bandwidth. And there currently is nothing to stop a commercial carrier from beginning to charge both the customer and the content provider much more for that transmission. And when that happens, the cost rapidly increases. And unlike broadcasting, it's not infrastructure that they own, right? It's infrastructure that they'll have to get from commercial providers. And that gets into all these interesting questions about broadband policy, which I didn't have time to touch on.
But does NPR or PBS have to pay Verizon to carry those programs?
They have to pay, they have server costs, right? So when you download it, you are going to a server, and they are paying that cost. So they pay some. It has not been, those have not been huge costs.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.